They laughed at its shape, they mocked its wings, and they called it ugly, a mistake of American engineering. In 1942, when the first Japanese pilots caught sight of the strange, bent-wing fighter rising from the blue Pacific horizon, they didn't feel fear, they felt amusement. The plane looked nothing like the elegant Mitsubishi Zero or the nimble Nakajima Ki 43. Instead, it had thick wings that dipped like a gull in flight, a massive propeller that seemed too heavy for its nose, and an engine that roared rather than hummed. To the Japanese ace pilots of the time, veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Coral Sea, this new American machine looked more like a flying mistake than a threat. They joked over radio chatter, calling it the broken-wing bird. But within months, that laughter would turn to horror, because the strange gull-winged fighter, the Vought F4U Corsair, would become one of the most feared aircraft in the entire Pacific War. The Japanese would soon give it a new name, one whispered with genuine dread, the Whistling Death. The war in the Pacific was raging. Island after island burned under relentless battles. From Guadalcanal to the Solomon Islands, the Empire of Japan dominated the skies. The Mitsubishi A6M0, light and agile, ruled with terrifying precision, could turn tighter, climb faster, and outmaneuver nearly anything America had in the air. American pilots, brave but under-equipped, often found themselves outgunned and outclassed. Many of them flew the aging F4F Wildcat, a dependable fighter, but slower and less agile than the Zero. Dogfights were brutal and brief. Too many never came home. The U.S. Navy needed something more, something that could not just match the Zero, but destroy it in its own territory. And in a small factory in Stratford, Connecticut, a group of engineers at Vought Aircraft were building something the world had never seen. The project began in 1938, long before America entered the war. The U.S. Navy had issued a challenge: design a single-seat fighter that could fly faster than 400 miles per hour, carry heavy guns, and still operate from an aircraft carrier. It sounded impossible. Carrier planes needed to take off and land on short decks, meaning their landing gear had to be short and strong. But high-speed aircraft needed large propellers, and large propellers required long landing gear. It was an engineering contradiction. That's when a young engineer named Rex Beisel came up with a radical idea, one that would make history. Instead of raising the landing gear or shrinking the propeller, he would bend the wings themselves. By giving the wings an inverted gull shape, the landing gear could stay short and strong while clearing the massive 13-foot propeller. The design looked bizarre, but it worked. The F4U Corsair was born. At the heart of the Corsair was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder monster capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. When combined with its large propeller, it gave the Corsair astonishing power. In test flights, it broke the 400 miles per hour barrier, making it the first U.S. naval aircraft to do so. It was fast, brutal, and loud. But there was a problem: it was too powerful. Early test pilots described the Corsair as a wild bull. It bounced violently during carrier landings, visibility over its long nose was poor, and it tended to stall during approach. The Navy, frustrated, declared it unfit for carrier use. For a time, the Corsair seemed doomed to be just another failed experiment. But then, the U.S. Marines took notice. The Marine Corps had no carriers to worry about. They operated from rough island airstrips, where a hard landing didn't mean disaster. What they needed was speed, range, and firepower. And the Corsair had all three. In early 1943, the first squadron of Marine Corsairs arrived in the Solomon Islands. Painted deep navy blue, their gull wings gleamed in the tropical sun. The pilots who climbed into them, men like Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington of the legendary Black Sheep Squadron, knew they were about to unleash something entirely new on the Pacific skies. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but the balance of air power was about to shift. It happened over the island of Bougainville. Japanese Zeros, sleek, silver, and confident, were on patrol when radar picked up unidentified blips approaching fast from the east. The pilots assumed they were Wildcats, easy prey. They turned to intercept. But as the shapes drew closer, they realized these weren't Wildcats. The aircraft were bigger, darker, and moving much faster. The engines gave off a strange, howling whistle, a sound the Japanese had never heard before. Then the American fighters dove. The sky erupted in streaks of tracer fire as the Corsairs unleashed their 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. The Zeros tried to turn, but the Corsairs didn't follow. They dived instead, using their superior speed to escape the trap, then climbed again, high into the sun. It was a new kind of air combat, one built not on agility but on raw speed and energy. The Americans had finally found a way to beat the Zero at its own game. By the end of that day, 5 Zeros had been shot down. Not a single Corsair was lost. It didn't take long for word to spread among Japanese squadrons. The new American plane, the one with the strange bent wings, wasn't to be underestimated. It was fast, heavily armed, and terrifyingly durable. Many pilots described its distinctive whistle, caused by air rushing through the wing root inlets, as an omen of death. They began to call it the Whistling Death. For Marine pilots, the nickname was a badge of honor. They'd finally found a machine that could go toe-to-toe with the Zero and win. Through 1943 and 1944, Corsairs dominated the skies over the Solomons, New Britain, and the Marshall Islands. Squadrons like VMF 214, VMF 112, and VF 17 tore through enemy formations, claiming hundreds of aerial victories. The plane, once mocked for its awkward wings, became the symbol of American aerial dominance. But the Corsair story was far from over, because what began as a fighter was about to evolve into a legend. The Corsair was born a rebel. It looked different, it sounded different, and for a while it didn't even fit on the ships it was built to defend. When the first prototype rolled out of the Vought factory in 1940, its immense Pratt Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roared with a power that no American fighter had ever known. It was the most powerful piston engine on the planet, and with it came problems no designer had ever faced before. That engine spun an enormous 13-foot propeller. To make room for it, engineers bent the wings downward, then up again, a strange inverted gull shape that made the plane look like some kind of predatory bird about to strike. It wasn't built for beauty. It was built for raw function. The design allowed for shorter landing gear, stronger undercarriage, and better clearance for that giant propeller. But the result was a plane that looked alien among the neat, straight-winged fighters of the time. At first, Navy pilots hated it. The cockpit sat far back, giving poor visibility on landing. The long nose blocked their view of the deck. When the Corsair tried to land on carriers, it bounced, stalled, and sometimes even flipped over. A widowmaker, they called it, too dangerous for carrier use. So the Navy gave up on it. The Marines, however, didn't. While the Navy focused on their safer Wildcats and Hellcats, the Marine Corps, fighting desperate battles from jungle airstrips, saw potential in the Corsair's raw power. It was fast, over 400 miles per hour, faster than anything Japan could field. It climbed like a rocket, carried more guns, more ammunition, more everything. What it lacked in manners, it made up for in rage. And so, in early 1943, a group of Marine squadrons began testing the F4U in combat. They painted shark mouths on its nose, patched bullet holes with beer cans, and flew them off muddy coral runways instead of carriers. These men didn't care about elegance, they cared about survival. Among them were the infamous Black Sheep Squadron, led by a maverick named Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. The first time Japanese pilots heard it, they didn't see it. They heard it. That unearthly, rising shriek echoing through the clouds long before the aircraft appeared. The Corsair's air intakes were positioned at the wing roots, and at high speeds they produced a high-pitched whistle, a terrifying sound that gave the plane its nickname among Japanese soldiers, Whistling Death. For the pilots below, that sound meant doom. Pappy Boyington and his men flew their Corsairs from a rough coral airstrip on the island of Vella, then later from Bougainville, a sweltering, disease-ridden front in the Solomon Islands campaign. The war there wasn't glamorous, it was mud, malaria, and death. But from those primitive bases, the Marines began rewriting air combat history. They ambushed Japanese Zero formations at dawn, using the Corsair's dive speed and climb rate to strike and vanish before the enemy could react. The Zero was nimble, yes, light and graceful like a dragonfly, but it couldn't match the Corsair's brute force. When the Whistling Death dove out of the sun, the sky itself seemed to tear open. One Japanese pilot later wrote in his diary, We could hear them scream like banshees. Then bullets came, always too fast to escape. Boyington's squadron flew with reckless courage. They were a ragtag group of misfits, outlaws, and troublemakers. Some court-martialed, some demoted, all eager for redemption. The Corsair was the perfect reflection of their own spirit. Untamed, unrefined, and unstoppable once unleashed. In December 1943, the Black Sheep took to the skies over Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese base in the Pacific. Hundreds of enemy aircraft rose to meet them. What followed would cement the Corsair's legend. The air over Rabaul was chaos. A swirling storm of tracer fire, exploding flak, and screaming engines. Boyington led his flight of F4Us in a high-speed attack run straight into the heart of the Japanese defense. "Don't dogfight," he shouted over the radio. "Slash and dive." That was the Corsair's secret. The Zero could turn tighter, but the Corsair could dive faster and climb higher. It was a hammer, not a rapier, and Boyington knew exactly how to use it. They hit the Japanese formation from above, guns blazing. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through the sky, stitching holes into zero after zero. The Corsair pilots didn't linger. They dove, fired, and then climbed back up like hawks circling for another strike. The Japanese pilots tried to follow, but their engines overheated. Their wings strained, and one by one they fell burning into the sea. By the end of the day, the Black Sheep had downed over a dozen enemy planes, at the cost of none. It wasn't luck. It was engineering and ferocity combined. The F4U could take hits the fragile Japanese fighters couldn't. Its radial engine could keep running even with bullets lodged in its cylinders. Its thick wings, those strange, bent gull wings, made it strong enough to absorb punishment and still bring its pilot home. When the Black Sheep returned to base that evening, their planes were riddled with holes, oil leaking, metal scorched, but they were alive. And for the first time, the Japanese knew fear in the skies. By early 1944, the F4U Corsair was no longer a misfit. It was the king of the Pacific. The Navy, seeing what the Marines had achieved, reevaluated the fighter. Carrier crews modified their decks, improved landing techniques, and finally brought the Corsair back to sea. The bird that had once been too wild for carriers now ruled them. Pappy Boyington became a legend. His squadron, the Black Sheep, shot down over 94 enemy aircraft in less than 3 months. Boyington himself became an ace among aces, with 28 confirmed kills. But behind the glory was the toll, exhaustion, death, loss. The Pacific War wasn't won by machines alone, but by men who refused to yield. The Corsair became their symbol. Loud, scarred, but indomitable. Its distinctive shape cut through the sunset skies of the Pacific, gull wings glinting gold, the whistle of its air intake echoing like a warning from the heavens. To the Marines who flew it, the sound was victory. To the Japanese who faced it, it was doom. And to history, it became something else entirely. Proof that the line between failure and greatness is often just a matter of time, courage, and persistence. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific War had changed. The U.S. Navy no longer fought for survival, it fought for dominance. The tide had turned, and the Americans were pushing westward, island by island, toward Japan itself. But the closer they came, the deadlier the skies became. Carrier groups now faced massive, coordinated Japanese air assaults, hundreds of Zeros, Betty bombers, and kamikazes. The old Wildcat fighters, though tough and reliable, were starting to feel their age. Even the Hellcat, the Navy's current favorite, struggled to keep up with the rapidly evolving battlefield. That's when the Navy took a second look at the F4U Corsair. The same plane once rejected as too dangerous for carrier operations, now promised the speed, range, and punch the Navy desperately needed. And thanks to months of field experience by the Marine Corps, many of the Corsair's early flaws had been solved. New landing techniques, called the curved approach, allowed pilots to keep the deck in sight until the last moment. Stronger landing gear and refined arresting hooks made carrier landings safer. Even the long nose problem was tamed by practice and confidence. By mid-1944, the Corsair was officially back aboard Navy carriers, and its arrival changed everything. When those distinctive gull wings folded upward on the flight deck, The sight alone lifted morale. The Corsair wasn't just a fighter anymore. It was a symbol of vengeance, a mechanical bird of prey reborn. The Japanese soon learned that what had once been a marine brawler on jungle runways had now joined the most powerful fleet in human history. The outcast had returned, and this time it ruled the ocean. June 1944, the Mariana Islands. The U.S. Navy's massive carrier fleet prepared for one of the largest aerial battles of the war, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over the blue expanse of the Philippine Sea, more than 900 Japanese aircraft rose to defend their empire. Against them, over 500 American fighters, many of them F-6F Hellcats, and a new contingent of F4U Corsairs freshly brought aboard from Marine squadrons. The air was thick with smoke, oil, and fire. The Corsairs, faster than almost anything else in the sky, dove into the fight with their distinctive whistle screaming through the clouds. From miles away, their sound could be heard. That eerie banshee shriek that once haunted the jungles of Bougainville now echoed over the open Pacific. Japanese pilots had a name for it now, Kasari no Sure, the chain of death, because once the Corsair locked onto you, escape was impossible. The F4U could dive at nearly 600 miles per hour without breaking apart. Could climb back to altitude in seconds, its huge engine gulping air like a beast reborn. Its 6 Browning machine guns fired with terrifying precision, turning enemy fighters into burning wreckage before they could even react. The American pilots began to call their Corsairs angels with claws. One Navy ace described the feeling. When you pushed that throttle forward, the plane roared like a lion. You could feel it straining to be free, like it wanted the fight more than you did. By the end of the Marianas battle, American forces had destroyed more than 350 Japanese aircraft in a single day, while losing fewer than 30 of their own. It was the moment Japan's air superiority died, and the Corsair's dominance truly began. Late 1944, the Japanese Empire was crumbling, but it wasn't surrendering. Instead, it turned to a new and terrifying weapon, kamikaze pilots. Young men, barely trained, were sent in explosive-laden planes to dive directly into American ships. The attacks were relentless, swarms of aircraft descending in suicide waves. The sky itself became a weapon. The Corsair was called upon to stop them. On the carriers of the fast task forces, Corsairs now flew constant combat air patrols, CAP, circles of fighters protecting the fleet from any threat. Their pilots lived on adrenaline and coffee, launching at dawn, landing at dusk, sometimes fighting 3 or 4 engagements a day. It was exhausting, brutal, and unlike any aerial war before it. But the Corsair as built for it. Its rugged design meant it could take hits and keep flying. Its speed meant it could intercept kamikazes before they reached the fleet. And its firepower, those 6 heavy guns, could rip apart a bomber or suicide plane before it got close. The Japanese soon realized their desperate new tactic was meeting an even deadlier defender. There are countless stories from those months of Corsair pilots diving headlong into enemy formations, sometimes colliding midair to save their shipmates below. One pilot, Lieutenant Dean Caswell, recalled shooting down 3 kamikazes in a single sortie, the third one just 100 yards from his carrier. Afterward, when he landed, his aircraft was riddled with holes, his fuel nearly gone, his hands shaking. But the ship below was safe. By early 1945, the Corsair wasn't just a fighter. It was a guardian, the last line between the fleet and destruction. As 1945 dawned, Japan was cornered. The Corsair, once doubted, once dismissed, now ruled the Pacific from sky to sea. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, it fought in nearly every major battle of the final campaign. When the U.S. fleet advanced closer to Japan's home islands, Corsairs struck airfields, supply convoys, and shipping lines. They flew escort for bombers, strafed enemy columns, and even served as fighter bombers, carrying rockets and bombs into the fray. The gull-wing fighter that had once struggled to land on a carrier could now do everything. At Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, Corsairs flew thousands of missions. Their engines thundered endlessly above the battlefield, a constant roar that shook the beaches and forests below. But with victory in sight, a strange silence began to settle over the men who flew them. They knew this was the end of an era. Jet engines were already emerging, sleek, fast, unstoppable. The days of propeller-driven warbirds were numbered. Yet even as the world moved on, the Corsair refused to fade quietly. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Corsairs were still in the air, patrolling, escorting, watching. The same machine that had been rejected at birth had ended the war as one of the most successful fighters ever built. Over 11-to-1 kill ratio, more than 64,000 combat sorties, and a legacy unmatched by any piston-engine fighter in the Pacific. On that final day, as the fleets anchored in Tokyo Bay, a few Corsairs circled above the gray waters. Their wings caught the morning light, bent like the wings of an angel or perhaps a demon that had found peace. And as their engines fell silent, history recorded their song, the whistle of death that had become the anthem of victory. The Pacific War had ended, but the Corsair's engine hadn't gone cold yet. As Japan surrendered and the world celebrated peace, most of America's warbirds were scrapped or sold off for parts. The mighty P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, even the beloved Hellcat, all were retired, their metal melted down to make toasters, cars, and peacetime machinery. But the Corsair was different. Its pilots refused to let it go. It had been too good, too reliable, too powerful to abandon. The Navy and Marine Corps kept it in service, even as new jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and F-9F Pantheriu entered the skies. They knew the Corsair could still do something jets couldn't. It could loiter low and slow, pound ground targets, and take punishment without falling apart. For the first time in history, a piston fighter would fly alongside jets and still earn respect. Across airbases in the Pacific, from Guam to Okinawa, Corsairs sat lined up under tropical rain. Their gull wings folded like resting birds. Mechanics wiped oil from their cowlings. Pilots ran their hands along the riveted fuselages. They knew that if war came again, and deep down everyone sensed it would, these machines would be ready. And it didn't take long for that new war to arrive. June 1950. Korea exploded into conflict. North Korean forces swept south across the 38th parallel, and once again the world was at war. The United States rushed to respond. Jets like the F-80 and F-84 dominated headlines, symbols of modern power, but in the rugged Korean mountains, speed wasn't everything. What mattered was endurance, firepower, and reliability. So the Navy reached back into its history and pulled the Corsair from the shadows. Within weeks, the old F-4Us were back in combat, their propellers slicing the cold Korean air. Pilots called them Old Faithful. Operating from both land bases and carriers, Corsairs flew thousands of close air support missions for UN troops pinned down in valleys and trenches. They struck bridges, railways, convoys, and when enemy forces got too close, they dropped napalm and rockets with devastating accuracy. The North Koreans quickly learned that the whistle of the Corsair meant only one thing: fire. Even with jets dominating the sky, the Corsair held its own. Its pilots flew low, hugging the terrain, dodging flak, and diving straight into battle like it was still 1944. In one legendary incident, Marine Captain Jesse Falmer shot down a Soviet-made MiG-15 jet with his propeller-driven Corsair. He fired a short burst from his .50 calibers and watched the MiG spiral into the mountains. It was a reminder to everyone. The old warbird still had claws. The Corsair's engine, that deep rumbling R-2800, echoed across the Korean valleys like thunder rolling through stone. Soldiers on the ground said you could feel it in your chest before you even saw it, and when you did, it was usually too late for the enemy. By the time the armistice came in 1953, the Corsair had flown over 80,000 sorties in Korea. It had become, once again, a hero not just of World War II, but of an entirely new era of warfare. After Korea, the Corsair's fighting days were almost over, but its legend was just beginning. Hollywood came calling. The F4U was too beautiful, too dramatic to fade quietly into history. Its long nose, its gull wings, its thunderous sound. It was pure cinematic power. So when television producers in the late 1950s looked for a star for their new war drama, they chose the only fighter that had personality: the Corsair. In 1952, Flying Leatherneck starring John Wayne put it on the big screen, roaring off Pacific runways in Technicolor glory. But its real pop culture immortality came later, in the 1970s, with the show Baa Baa Black Sheep, also known as Black Sheep Squadron, inspired by the real-life exploits of Major Pappy Boyington and his VMF-214 squadron. The show was a hit. Millions watched as Corsairs soared again, engines roaring, guns blazing, gull wings folding. For a new generation, the F4U became a symbol not just of war, but of freedom, rebellion, and courage. Children built Corsair model kits, veterans watched in nostalgia, and even modern pilots admired its grace. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was myth. At air shows across America, aging Corsairs found new life. Restored and painted in dark navy blue, they roared across the sky once again, leaving trails of smoke and memory. Every time one of those engines started, the crowd would go silent, then erupt in cheers as the whistling death took to the air one more time. Today, more than 80 years after its first flight, the F4U Corsair still flies, a living echo of an age when courage was made of metal and oil. Historians call it one of the greatest fighter aircraft ever built. Pilots call it something else, a friend. It was a machine that demanded respect, brutal on takeoff, merciless on landing, but pure magic in the air. It rewarded skill, punished mistakes, and forgave nothing except bravery. Across museums and memorials, Corsairs sit in silence, wings folded like sleeping giants. Their once fierce engines now rest, but their stories hum through the air like ghostly echoes. Visitors run their hands along the cold metal and whisper the same question. How did they build something so alive? The answer lies in what it represented. The Corsair was the spirit of innovation, a design so wild it shouldn't have worked, but did. It was the story of pilots who tamed the untamable. It was the sound of freedom echoing through clouds of war. And though its engine no longer roars over the Pacific, its whistle still haunts the memories of those who once heard it. The Japanese pilots who once mocked it called it whistling death. To the Americans who flew it, it was angel's wings. And to history, it remains something even greater, the last great warbird that refused to die. The story of the Corsair was not just one of bravery, dogfights, and victories. It was a story of engineering genius meeting wartime necessity. Every rivet, every curve, every roaring inch of metal had a purpose, designed not by chance, but by the exacting minds of engineers who understood that speed, firepower, and resilience could make or break the Pacific campaign. At the heart of the Corsair's power was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial powerhouse that produced over 2,000 horsepower. It was unlike anything pilots had ever felt. When the throttle was pushed forward, the engine didn't just start. It announced its arrival. The vibration coursed through the fuselage, the propeller sliced the air like a guillotine, and the aircraft seemed to come alive in the hands of a skilled pilot. Early test flights had called it a wild beast, and that description was no exaggeration. The enormous propeller created one of the central design challenges. 13 feet of spinning metal required clearance from the landing gear, yet carrier operations demanded short, sturdy undercarriage. The solution, the inverted gull wing, was revolutionary. By bending the wings downward from the fuselage and then upward at the tips, designers allowed the landing gear to be short and strong while the propeller cleared the deck. To engineers, it was a stroke of genius. To new pilots, it looked odd, even grotesque. Yet function outweighed form, and in battle, the wings proved nearly indestructible. Inside the cockpit, the pilot station was a world of its own. The long nose limited forward visibility, creating a fearsome challenge during takeoff and landing, but the control layout was designed for efficiency. Instruments were grouped for rapid reading, switches placed within precise reach, and the gun sight calibrated for accuracy. Every lever, every gauge, every pedal had been tested and retested to give the Corsair a lethal edge in combat. Pilots who mastered it learned to think of the aircraft as an extension of their own body, the plane's gull wings, massive engine, and armament responding to their touch like a predator listening to a hunter's command. The Corsair's armament was equally impressive. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns lined the wings, capable of delivering devastating firepower in a fraction of a second. It could carry bombs and rockets under its wings, making it versatile enough for close air support or long-range strikes. The combination of speed, heavy armament, and rugged build meant the Corsair could take on multiple enemy fighters simultaneously, dive away from danger, and return to base battered but intact. In many ways, it redefined what a fighter could do in the Pacific theater. Aerodynamics played a crucial role in its supremacy. The inverted gull wing reduced drag at high speeds, allowing the Corsair to reach velocities over 400 miles per hour in its early models, and even higher in later versions. Its robust radial engine allowed climbs unmatched by most opponents, while the wing's shape contributed to stability during tight maneuvers. The aircraft's design was a perfect balance of aggression and control, a machine that could dive like a hammer, climb like a falcon, and roll with precision in dogfights. Every mission demonstrated the Corsair's adaptability. Pilots learned to exploit its strengths, diving to gain speed and energy, climbing to regain altitude advantage, and using the plane's sheer power to escape situations that would have doomed lighter fighters. Stories of Corsairs intercepting enemy bombers at impossible speeds, chasing Zeros across the sun, or diving into kamikaze formations to protect the fleet became legendary. The engineering allowed these feats, but the courage and skill of the pilots brought them to life. Even the notorious whistle, the sound that earned it the name Whistling Death, was a byproduct of engineering. Air rushing through the wing root intakes created a high-pitched scream that terrified Japanese pilots. It was unintentional yet effective. The psychological effect was immense. Enemy airmen would often recognize the whistle before they saw the plane, and by then it was already too late. The Corsair became not only a weapon of destruction but a tool of fear, a masterstroke of both physics and fate. As the war progressed, engineers continued refining the design. Landing gear improvements allowed carrier-based operations, modifications enhanced visibility, and strengthened wing structures permitted heavier ordnance loads. Each change was tested rigorously, and by the time the Corsair was deployed across every major Pacific battle, it had evolved from an experimental prototype into the ultimate fighter of its generation. Beyond combat, the Corsair's legacy extended into the Cold War era. Its reliability and ruggedness ensured it remained in service in Korea, where it performed thousands of sorties, supporting troops and engaging enemy aircraft. Even in the face of emerging jet technology, the Corsair's unique combination of speed, firepower, and durability made it indispensable. Its gull wings carved arcs over mountains and seas, a reminder that even in an era of rapid technological change, brilliant engineering and human courage could still dominate the skies. The story of the F4U Corsair is ultimately a story of daring innovation, relentless refinement, and the symbiotic bond between man and machine. From its awkward, ridiculed prototype to its status as a feared and respected warbird, every curve, every engine, every wing was a testament to human ingenuity. It became the fighter that no one could ignore, the machine that commanded respect, and the legend that inspired generations of pilots, engineers, and historians alike. Even today, when a restored Corsair's engine roars at an airshow, its gull wings glinting in the sunlight, spectators understand why it earned the names Whistling Death and Angel's Wings. It is not merely a plane. It is a symbol of courage, engineering brilliance, and the audacity to turn a misfit into a hero. Its legacy remains etched in history, soaring wherever wings can carry, whispering through time the story of a fighter that truly changed the world.